Well, in this video, we're going to be talking about revenue models. And so what we're going to be covering really first and foremost is what is a revenue model. And then we're going to talk about some of the different types of revenue models. Now, some might make sense and might apply to your business and others might not. But ultimately, we're looking at other or different opportunities for us to be able to generate revenue and profit for our business. So to start things out, we're going to keep things fairly simple, and we're first going to talk through, well, really, what is this concept that we call revenue? And I apologize if this is fairly basic for you. Feel free and fast forward a little bit to get to kind of the revenue model piece. So revenue basically is simply just income generated from the sale of goods and services. So if we are producing a physical good or we offer some type of service, the money that we bring in as a result of a transaction that takes place between the buyer, which would be the customer, and the seller would be us, would constitute revenue. So if you have a coffee shop and you sell cups of coffee and lattes, the revenue is the revenue you generate from that particular exchange when the consumer purchases the cup of coffee. If you are a software company and you offer a service on a platform based upon subscriptions, then your revenue is basically the total dollar amount of the monthly subscriptions from paying customers. So that we call revenue. Now, when we talk about a revenue model, what we're actually referring to is essentially a component of our business model. So we'll talk about business models in future weeks, but it's a component of our business model that actually explains how we're going to earn revenue. So while revenue is the actual money itself that's generated, the revenue model explains ultimately, based upon the goods and services that we offer, how are we going to earn revenue? And this is a pretty important question to address, right? Because ultimately we know that a business is not going to be successful if we don't have a way of bringing in revenue to support the operations of our business. So we can have the best of intentions in trying to help people and make the world a better place. But if our plans are to operate a for-profit business, and that's the structure that we choose, we ultimately need a way to actually capture that value for ourselves. Because ultimately we can't do any good if we can't pay for our basic operating expenses, right? If we can't pay for rent and pay to market and pay really talented people to come and work for us and to pay for utilities and equipment and all those other types of things. So we need to have a way of bringing in revenue to support those particular functions, right? Now, if you were a nonprofit entity, this whole discussion is essentially not necessarily valuable simply because we're going to rely on funding and those types of things. But we're talking about for-profit businesses, and for-profit businesses need to have some kind of reliable source of revenue so they can cover all the expenses. So as we kind of talk through some of these different revenue models, there's a couple of things that you might want to have in the back of your mind, questions you might want to have as you're trying to decipher which of these revenue models makes the most sense for your business. Now, on top of that, what I'm going to add here is these revenue models are not mutually exclusive. And so you'll see plenty of examples of larger corporations that have multiple different revenue streams, which is by design, right? They're trying to reduce their reliance on one particular revenue stream and ultimately increase the total revenue of the business. Having a lot of revenue streams really helps with that. Obviously, as you're starting out, though, you really don't want to have a ton of revenue streams because that is a lot of work to maintain and there's a lot of infrastructure needed to support all of these other revenue streams. It's something that we diversify into as we continue to grow and as we look for other opportunities for expansion. So a couple things to keep in mind. One, how much are customers willing to pay? It's a very important question. It doesn't necessarily dictate the revenue model, but as you're thinking about revenue models, you might want to think about, well, how much can I capture via this revenue model on a per transaction basis? Is that enough to support my business? How many customers do I need to support the revenue model and the subsequent fixed costs and operating expenses that I would incur in order to support that model? And then ultimately, how much does this revenue model contribute to my total revenue? And that's only if you're going to be launching with several different revenue streams. So With that in mind, and those questions kind of in the back of your mind, we're going to go through and we're going to talk about some of the different revenue models. Now, some of these will be really, really simple. Others will be a little bit more complicated, but you'll kind of get the ins and outs of them. So the first and probably the simplest of all is what we call unit sale, which is sometimes referred to as asset sale. If you ever read Business Model Generation, which is a fantastic book that goes into the different components of a business model that we talk about a little bit later in the course, they use the asset sale terminology, but unit sale is essentially the same thing. So with the unit sale or asset sale revenue model, we're actually generating revenue based upon the number of units sold. Now you might be thinking that doesn't really differentiate this from anything else. Well, let me add a couple of pieces of information. Typically in a unit sale model, it's most common when we're selling a particular item and the consumer takes ownership over the item. So if you were to think about the cup of coffee that we talked about before, selling a cup of coffee is a unit sale model because you've got two parties, right? We've got the buyer, and then we also have the seller. And there's a transaction that takes place. And so the buyer will pay some kind of cash or money. And then the seller provides the good, which in this case is coffee. And so this is a unit sale model because there's a transfer of ownership that actually takes place, right? Now the seller is in possession of the money and the buyer is in possession of the good or the service. Now it doesn't necessarily need to be a physical good, right? If you were to sell like Apple way back when they used to kind of sell music, and now a lot of their revenue is derived from just licensing with Apple Music and subscriptions and those types of things. But if you were to purchase a song, and you can't see me, but I'm using kind of the air quotes with purchase, you essentially acquire an actual digital license to that particular music. And so it's now frankly in your possession. Now you have certain restrictions on that, but ultimately you are now in ownership of that particular license. So it can be digital products as well. If you were to purchase a digital download, that is a unit sale because you're acquiring ownership of that, although you have some restrictions. So this is probably the most common revenue model. It's very simple. It's been around forever, and it's one it's pretty tried and true, and it's something to definitely take a look at. Now, another revenue model that's been around for some time is called the advertising revenue model. And the advertising revenue model, you're probably familiar with it. Ultimately, we're gaining revenue by advertising goods and services. Now, this one here looks a little bit different as far as how we set it up, and there are certain types of businesses that tend to rely more heavily on this advertising model, and you'll kind of understand the reasons why as we kind of go through this. So thinking about kind of our buyer and seller sort of model here, with advertising, we are kind of in the middle of a couple of different parties. And so let's say that this is us right here. And then we have an advertiser. So this would be someone who has a particular ad that they want to show and they want to reach people. And then here we can call them a potential buyer, let's say. So we're in the middle here. And so ultimately our goal is to attract as much of these potential buyers as possible so that we can then sell access to them to an advertiser. And ultimately our ability to attract a lot of viewers is kind of correlated to our ability to gain a lot of advertising revenue. So the most common types of businesses that we see use an advertising type model tend to be newspapers, especially with digital content, where newspapers provide access and to information and try to get a lot of viewers, and then in turn take that viewership and of course monetize it via advertising. You see this happen with television networks that buy the rights to certain programming and then try to get a lot of viewership and then sell access to that viewership with ads. So this revenue model is directly tied to the number of viewers, which is why it's really difficult to get any kind of traction if you don't have a lot of viewers. So this isn't one that I really recommend that you launch with. So if you're thinking about, let's say, starting a blog and you're going to advertise it and you're going to link with Google Ads and you're going to show kind of PPC advertisements in the sidebars and different places, you might make some money, but it's really hard to get a lot of it if you don't have a lot of viewers, right? And that's why with a lot of companies that go this route, their focus is on viewership and content creation and trying to get a critical mass of people and then monetizing that later on with advertising if that's what they want to go with. But to start out, it's really tough because it doesn't really provide a reliable stream of revenue, and you really need that revenue stream to be able to build up cash to help support paying for your cost and be able to grow your actual business. The next revenue model we're going to explore is what we call the data revenue model. Now, this revenue model is typically common with social media companies, and the way that this works, it's very similar to an advertising model. The only difference here is that we're dealing with data instead of showing ads, although you'll see a lot of social media companies that do a multitude of them. So ultimately, what we're going to do is we're going to generate revenue by selling preferably high quality or exclusive or valuable information. And if you think about this, this is really the revenue model for a lot of social media companies like Facebook and others. They give away, typically how they do this is they use a kind of a variation of freemium. So there's a free item, right? Free product, free service. In this case for Facebook, it's the ability to use Facebook and Instagram. And so that in turn, right, you get a lot of people that are viewers, let's say, and want to use the free services. And then what Facebook can then go ahead and do is it can do a couple things. One, it's able to utilize this revenue model, this advertising revenue model here, which it certainly does. And you're scrolling through your feed, you'll see advertisements, and that's a way that Facebook earns money because it charges those businesses to sponsor those posts or to run those advertisements. But then what it can also do is it also take that information that you willingly provide based upon, navigating the website, interacting with certain posts by providing information about yourself, and then it can take that information and then it can try to sell that to some kind of third party if it chooses to do so. And if you read through a lot of the agreements, which no one does because they're incredibly long, a lot of them include some verbiage of that they can provide access to the data. And that's kind of the cost of the platform, right? We think the service is free because it's easy to get. We just register and answer a couple of questions. But the service really isn't free because it gives Facebook access to a lot of this data, which allows them to, in turn, gain revenue through advertising, but also allows them to sell access to information to third parties and those other types. The next revenue model we're going to talk about is the intermediation revenue model. And this one sounds a little intimidating, but it's really not all that intimidating. The way that I want you to think about intermediation is ultimately based upon generating revenue by, let's say, facilitating an exchange. So in this case, we've got two parties, right? We've got a buyer and a seller. So we've got buyer here, and then we've got a seller here. And the business, their job is to facilitate this exchange that takes place between the buyer and the seller. They don't really take ownership of everything. They really just provide the ability for a transaction to happen. So a common example of an intermediation model would be like a real estate broker. If you purchase a home, the realtor will kind of act as this intermediary here and will help facilitate the transaction between the buyer and the seller. They'll help with paperwork. They'll help you go look at different homes and kind of filter down a list based upon some of the important criteria for you. And then they'll help you with the offer and doing the negotiation side of things. And then ultimately at the conclusion, they'll help process all the paperwork and all those sorts of things as well. That would be an example of intermediation. We've also seen through technology companies a way to provide intermediation much faster and to do it at scale, right? Because if you're a realtor, obviously it's time consuming to facilitate one transaction. So with technology, we can remove kind of the human element and we can allow the transaction to take place without really any human involvement. And so if you think about platforms such as Uber and Lyft and Airbnb, they very much so run on this intermediation model because they're allowing you to, in Uber's case, engage in a transaction with a driver. And Uber doesn't own any of the cars, and Uber doesn't, employ really any of the drivers. They merely provide a platform that allows the buyers and sellers to connect. So intermediation is very much so kind of based upon facilitating that exchange. And so if you were running an intermediation model, your goal would be to try to get as many buyers and sellers here so that ultimately you can facilitate a lot of transactions, and it makes it really valuable for everyone. Because if you're Uber and you have a bunch of buyers, so a bunch of people that want to get rides to places, but you don't have these sellers here, the drivers, then it really doesn't, the platform doesn't work, right? You need a critical mass of both people. So you have to creatively look at ways to be able to increase the number of buyers and sellers so that ultimately the platform itself is much more reliable. Another revenue model that's still been around for quite some time that works really well is what we call a licensing model. And I'm going to go over licensing as well as kind of franchising at the same time, and you're going to see why. So in a licensing model, we're generating revenue by giving somebody access to kind of like our intellectual property. And so we're giving people the right to use our IP. So if you think about it, if you have a patent for something, which essentially gives you the exclusive ability to produce a particular product, right? Or a product that has a certain design or a certain function or does something in a certain way. Or if you've created a brand and people recognize that brand and want to put it on t-shirts and different merchandise and things like that, you can essentially license the ability to do that. Or if you create a board game and you've created all the instructions and the pieces and all those sorts of things, and you don't want to produce it yourself, instead you can sell access to the game, in this case your intellectual property, to someone else like a board game maker, and they can pay you a royalty based upon how many they produce. This is also really common in music, where artists create songs and they license them to some of the popular platforms like Apple Music and Spotify and others, and they get royalties via licensing, right? So every listen to a song, an artist gets like a fraction of a cent as a result of that. So it's not anything individually, but can add up pretty quickly as well. So you're really just creating something and giving permission to be able to use that, and that helps generate revenue. Now, this is very similar to franchising and kind of why I go over them in the same vein. The only difference here is under franchising, you're giving someone not only access to IP, but also kind of operating procedures on how to run the business. So you're essentially giving someone a playbook. So this works one of two ways. If you are the person that is franchising, you'll operate, let's say, a fast casual restaurant, and you've operated one for a period of time and you get really good at it. And so you start to codify or write down all your procedures, and then you want to get approval to franchise so that somebody else can pay you money to operate that business. So not only do they get access to your IP, but they get access to just your way of doing things, right? So every single process that you've created. So the benefit for you is it allows you to scale and grow faster by reducing your risk, since somebody else is actually running the business and making the investment. And the benefit for the person that is actually acquiring the franchise, or at least getting an agreement to do the franchise, is they've got a tried and true way of operating a business that somebody else has already vetted. Right? So instead of me as the entrepreneur trying to figure out product market fit and then fine tune everything, I'm getting something that is very plug and play so I can use it immediately instead of trying to test the market and trying to make sure that there's a need and then trying to develop a solution for that particular need as well. And the last revenue model we're going to talk about in this video is the subscription revenue model. Now, the subscription revenue model has been around for quite some time and is actually probably one of the more popular revenue models today, with a lot of different services that we see now kind of going subscription based. So the basic concept of this is we are going to generate revenue by charging customers for, let's say, access to a product or service. So notice subscription and asset or unit sale or asset sale are actually pretty similar if you think about them. And there's kind of a genesis, if you will, on where unit sale is kind of moved more towards the subscription type model. Under the subscription revenue, first off, these go hand in hand. So that's part of the interesting thing is you can take the same product or service and you can find a way to generate revenue from it differently. So in a unit sale, let's take music, for example. You could create physical CDs, right? We don't really use them a great deal anymore, but it was popular at a time, not too long ago, where you would buy a physical compact disc and you would put it into a player and then you would listen to that song. And now we kind of use subscriptions a little bit more heavily. So instead of purchasing the actual CD, we now just pay a fee, let's say anywhere from $10 to $15 a month, and we get access to everything. Now, ultimately, we are paying for only access. Now, access is different than ownership. If we purchase a CD, going with this unit sale model here, we have ownership. Under subscriptions, we have access. So when we stop paying for something, so like when we cancel our Netflix subscription, we don't own any of those movies. We don't own any of the shows. So we no longer have the ability to access them. And so that's very different. Businesses are liking the subscription model because instead of just charging you a one-time fee for a song or for software, what if I charged you a subscription and now I have a recurring revenue stream that I can count on, so it's very predictable, and it creates a lot more value for me long term, as long as I maintain it and add features and fix bugs and do those sorts of things to get you to continue to use it. And if you're continue to be happy with it, then you're going to pay me a subscription all the time, which is very, very wonderful, because one of the most difficult things of running a business is you have a hard time predicting revenue. But under a subscription model, someone who's paid you the prior month is probably going to pay you the next month and the following month, assuming that you're continuing to put out good content and provide access to the service that people want. So now that you've kind of had a little bit or some familiarity with some of the different types of revenue models here, and there are certainly more, but these are probably some of the more common ones, I would encourage you to take the product or service that you have, and I would just go through each of these revenue models and try to ask yourself how you would utilize that revenue model. So some might be pretty easy, right? So if you're opening up a coffee shop, you can say, well, if it's a unit sale, I'm just going to sell cups of coffee. That's pretty easy. If it's advertising, though, which is probably not a good thing, right? Just so we're on the same page. But if you wanted to, let's say, well, we could give out free cups of coffee, and then we would get a lot of people that would come because people like free stuff. And then I can go to other businesses and say, hey, I've got like 1,000 customers that come in every, day. Would you like to reach those people? And how much would you pay? So that doesn't mean it's a good way of getting revenue, right? Advertising is probably not a good way of gaining revenue in that example. But what you're doing is you're kind of allowing yourself to envision different revenue streams for your business. And although it might not make sense at the beginning, what you can often find is you might identify a secondary or even tertiary revenue stream that maybe not now, but later on and after a period of time, it makes sense for you to explore. So I would encourage you to kind of engage in that exercise of trying to think about different ways of making money off of your idea. Oftentimes you end up at the same spot with the original revenue model, but you might surprise yourself and you might find that there is another way of gaining revenue that actually might make a little bit more sense for you and make sense for your business model.